let's talk about Jennifer Lopez. Sorry, I shouldn't be so excited about this. Let's talk about Jennifer Lopez.
More somber.
I guess we kind of saw this coming, unfortunately. Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck are done. She has filed for divorce. She filed, I think, on August 20th. Maybe August 20th, just recently. And that was actually their second wedding anniversary. They had 2 weddings. But
Of their formal wedding?
The formal wedding.
I see.
Not the elopement to Vegas. But so, yes, she filed specifically on that date, it looks like. And we are hearing rumblings. I don't know who we are. I have heard, I have read that there is apparently no prenup. So we all know that when you file your petition, there's a section, and usually you would include somewhere that there's a prenup, just to kind of
let the court be on notice.
Court know it's going to be about the property. It's going to be a little different. And she did not include anything about the prenup. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no prenup. It would just be very odd to not include it there.
So one thing I was going to point out actually is the fact that she did file in pro per, and so perhaps there is a prenup and she just simply made a clerical error on her forms.
No.
They're not as intuitive as people sometimes think, and so perhaps she just didn't see where that should be indicated and it's a mistake. But if not, and they don't have a prenup, then that's a whole different can of worms than what and I think traditionally, at least I feel like celebrities typically have prenups. So
well, you would think celebrity, this isn't their first marriage.
Or their second.
Well, it is Ben's second.
Okay.
And Jennifer's, I think it was her 4th. You would think they would know at this point that it might be helpful, even just to streamline the process at the end.
Yeah.
But, let's assume there's no prenup. They were married about 2 years. During that time, Jennifer made she made a lot of movies, at least 3, including her movie This Is Me Now, which accompanied her new album. Unfortunately, these projects didn't go super well for her. 2024 has not been Jennifer's year, but maybe we're getting it all out of the way for a big 2025.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I was going to speak a little bit to the lack of prenup, just in terms of when we see some cases where we might see a prenup versus not. When you were saying this is her 4th marriage versus his 2nd, I feel like sometimes people have that attitude of well, we're all in and we're not going to have a prenup because that's an out and we're all in. And not to suggest that prenups are an out or that you're not all in if you have one, but I feel like that is sometimes a common mindset that sometimes people take is we don't need a prenup because we're all in and we don't want that as a backup. So I would love to have been a fly on the wall if there was a discussion about not having one versus having one and what the discussions were, because have you seen This Is Me Now?
I've seen clips.
Okay.
I've seen clips.
So very much so, that's the attitude of the show is this is
our end game.
Yeah,
this is what everything was for.
And it's not specifically about them as a couple. It's actually a documentary about her and her journey. But that's kind of the tone of that show in the documentary. So anyways, that's speculation and not related to anything legal. But
I think we should also say, just while on the subject of prenups, sometimes they are a good idea, even if you're not changing anything and you want your divorce to be decided by California family code. Going over what your separate property is and memorializing that just would make things easier at the end, even, if you...
No, I get what you're saying. Yeah. I think it's important. I get what you're saying. I think there's also a misconception that prenups are only for a specific set of cases where there's I think what you're trying to say is even if they were just outlining what was theirs before marriage, given their respective assets, that would also be helpful in their case to streamline the divorce process. Not to mention the fact that obviously they acquired a certain amount of assets through these projects that they've done, and I don't know if they've purchased property, but that's not, I think, a prenup could have covered.
Yeah, so that's one thing. They did buy a house, and it is now up for sale. So, assuming they bought it together during the marriage, it's presumed. Well, it was bought during the marriage. It's going to be presumed community
property. Yeah.
So they'll have to divide that.
Where's the home located? Is it here in LA? Okay,
it's in Brentwood. And she is not asking for spousal support, and she is also asking that the court's ability to award Ben's spousal support be terminated.
Okay.
Very standard things. I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things. So I know we're on the subject of no prenup. So if there's no prenup, we know that they're going to follow California family code, community property. and they can deviate that via settlement. I wanted to bring our attention back to Gisele Bündchen and Tom Brady. They famously filed for divorce, and they had a judgment immediately ready with it. That was in Florida, so I don't know about any cooling off periods. But in California, it's interesting. Or why don't you tell us? I'm just chatting away.
No. So in California, there's a mandatory 6-month cool-off period. So if we get a unicorn case where the parties come to us and they say, we're ready to separate, we're going to file, but we have an agreement with respect to the division of our assets, spousal support, everything else that falls under the dissolution umbrella, and they want to enter the judgment, let's say the same day they file, you can do so, but the court is not technically going to deem you divorced until 6 months has passed from the date of that your initial petition filing. So the only ramification really is the fact that you won't be able to remarry before that 6-month period. But other than that, there's nothing that comes to mind that I think is really impacted by the cool-off period. And like I said, it's kind of a unicorn case because more often than not, the divorce kind of ends up taking about 6 months, if not longer.
Right. Another thing, so one of the tabloids was saying that they were trying to come to an agreement, which makes sense, would be kind of standard. But they couldn't, and that is why she filed. So I think I've definitely had a case where to kind of get things moving along, you end up filing something. Sometimes it's the petition, sometimes it's a trial setting conference. Have you seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what's hard about settlement discussions, right? Is your only remedy is then to pull in the court. And I'm sure you had this discussion with your clients a lot. It's like, well, we kind of have two routes we can go. We can continue to do these settlement discussions, which feel like they're going nowhere, but keep trying. Of course, you also have the option of private mediation as well. But again, that still falls, in my mind, under the category of settlement discussions. Or you seek the court's involvement by way of filing a petition or a trial setting conference. And again, it can be strategic to get the ball moving if you're really not getting anywhere with respect to settlement. So yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot. And maybe perhaps that's, when we were speaking about the case, not right here immediately, offline, what's the proper term? I don't know.
I think
offline. We had even said maybe perhaps that's why she filed pro per, like just to kind of
get things going.
Yeah.
I think in our case, rarely are we talking about the settlement terms before we've filed for divorce. I think in most cases we're filing. There's no issue there. But I think what I see most often is we're doing settlement negotiations, going back and forth. Kind of feels like maybe we're no longer negotiating in good faith, or maybe we are negotiating in good faith and we're just
not going to find a meeting
come
of
to
the
an
minds,
agreement, right? And we'll file a request for trial setting conference. Kind of showing everyone we think maybe we're done. Settlement discussions never end. You can settle before the morning of trial. You can settle during lunch,
right? But it's kind of it puts the case on a path forward. Whereas if you're only in settlement discussions, again, that's the other remedy is going forward. So,
I think you're definitely right. I just also quickly wanted to touch on, so we know she filed in August, but she listed her the date of separation as being, I think it was April 28th.
Okay.
We've talked about this over and over again, but we'll just remind viewers that date of separation is important because anything that you accumulate or any debts you incur after the date of separation is presumed to be your separate property. So that date of separation date it's important for things.
It's more important than the date that your dissolution's entered per se, because I think there's a misconception also that that's when the community property interest ends, is that the dissolution or entry the final judgment, but it's actually that date of separation date. So,
and you can technically, have a date of separation without having filed, and the community is not going to be gaining an interest in assets or debts that you may be acquiring.
I was going to say one of the pros of filing and then indicating that date of separation earlier than later, though, is if, let's say, you wait to file and you have a day of separation in mind and you guys technically are separated, but if there's any question, right, it's a factual, we've talked about this extensively, I think, on the podcast. It's such a factual, intensive, he said, she said, and we're proving things that are not fun to have to prove up, and it can get a little messy.
Give yourself the best path forward and file soonish after things have broken down, I think is my advice.
Yes.
Okay, now a specific thing to Jennifer and Ben is
Oh, sorry, totally.
Go.
Well, we were going to talk a little bit about day separation. I recall specifically with respect to the fact that they've been kind of photographed.
Right.
And that this is, well, it's not a total surprise. Everybody has been speculating that they've been separated and being photographed separately, but then with each other's respect, like with their children.
So I don't think they've been seen
not their
together.
shared children. I apologize.
Right.
They're the children of their.
So to be clear, they both came into the marriage with children.
Yes.
I think Jennifer had 2 children and Ben had 3.
Okay.
So I don't think we've seen Jennifer and Ben together for a while, but we have seen them with each other's children. And interestingly, and I actually now I don't know where this falls, if their date of separation was April. Recently enough, we saw even Jennifer Gardner, Ben Affleck's ex-wife and the mother of his children, or their children, at Disneyland with at least one of Jennifer Lopez's children.
Yeah.
So they're clearly a very blended family.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I've never had a case where there's been a blended family aspect to this extent. And I don't think, just as an initial impression, it would influence the day of separation because I don't think that it has any bearing that they've been seen with each other as children. But I do think it's interesting. And I suppose you could argue that they didn't believe they were separated because of
they're caring for the other one's child.
Again, we haven't seen it. I haven't had a case.
I haven't seen it. And we don't know if she's making this, if this will even come up, but it is interesting.
Yeah, it's just interesting, to speculate and kind of see how day of separation can also play out. We've talked about this again with this particular podcast platform is celebrities are photographed and seen together, and it's like, well, what was really happening behind the scenes
what was the
versus
true story?
What's projected in public. So,
well, and then on the topic of blended families, that leads me into a bigger discussion I wanted to have. So there were no children of the marriage, but it seems like the respective children became very close.
Yeah.
And legally, we know that the court has no jurisdiction over that. So we wanted to point that out. But, hopefully they would take into consideration the closeness that these, kids feel.
It seems that they're already doing so. I mean, the fact that she's filed and that it continues to be a good relationship between her and his children and vice versa, I think is great. I mean, that's the best case scenario. That's, we're going to have a separate discussion about blended families soon. And I think that that's one beautiful aspect of actually separations is the fact that these families can come together and then hopefully even if they part ways that they can still remain in each other's lives because obviously they've become a major figure in these children's lives. They're older kids, but still it's that'd be nice. That would be really nice. Of course, we don't know how amicable Ben and J-Lo are.
Right.
Jennifer Lopez. Does she go by J-Lo still?
I think so. Okay. I think it's a fun
is that
nickname.
Is that a fair nickname?
Yeah.
Okay.
She has an album called J-Lo.
Okay.
She likes the name, I think. I think we're good. Okay. Last thing I wanted to talk about specifically about Jennifer and I guess it's actually not specific. It's a hypothetical about them. But we know that they were together before. They broke up famously. They got back together and they got married. Now, let's assume that they had been married previously, then divorced, and then they got back together. I wonder if there's question about what would happen to that divorce decree, the original.
Yeah. Well, I guess in this case, there would have been such a passage of time that even, let's think about this. So let's say they separated, their judgment was entered the first time in, when was it? I don't even know.
Well, I guess we don't even need to talk about them specifically. Yeah. I may have messed this hypothetical up, but just the idea of
separating
being married.
And getting remarried.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I assume the judgment stays in place, but then to have a new date of marriage, then community acquire thereafter, that would be my assumption.
Yeah, so when whatever was decided in that divorce decree
remains in effect.
And so, if you think about maybe a short separation, or it's not a separation, it's more than a separation, a short divorce, they get back together maybe a year and a half or 2 years later and they get married, they are now coming into the marriage with very similar assets to what they had while they were originally married. So the community is probably very similar to what it was during the marriage, but now it's all divided.
Yeah.
And you don't start accumulating, community interests. Again,
it
starts from that new marriage date.
Yeah, that's messy because I feel like think about a home that's separate property that technically, so it's deemed separate property post-judgment, but in the first marriage it was community.
Yeah.
Then it's separate, and then let's say you start acquiring a community interest in that separate property. Then we have a whole, then it has to be dealt with again. So that is interesting. I did have a case with a similar fact pattern but they didn't divorce, but there was a long-term separation of many, many years. And during that time frame, there was a purchase of a home, But they were separated for 5+ years, but they never divorced. And then,
But then if they get back together,
moved back into the home, and then shortly thereafter, someone filed, and it was like a question of, well, what's the date of separation? Because this home was purchased during the separation period. Well, presumptively, we don't have 2 date of separations in the state of California.
No, it seems like you have to get rid of the original date of separation.
Well,
right?
there is no original, of course. In this case, they didn't have an original. I get what you're saying.
I'm sorry.
Later in time, they didn't divorce in this.
They
case.
didn't even file for divorce.
No.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was we didn't end up going to trial, so there was no answer to our.
To me, and I don't know who you were representing, it would seem most persuasive that if you get back together, the date of separation
is a later in time date.
Is the later in time date.
Yeah, but it's complicated, right?
Very
when you have that
complicated.
long of a separation and you're acquiring property, I think that's one of the complicated things about community property estates. But anyways, yes, to your point about the fact pattern, that would have been interesting.
Would have been.
Yeah, I actually think another thing that, and maybe you were going to bring it up, so I apologize if I'm jumping ahead. But speaking of her documentary and the fact that they did this and it was this public project, it was her project, but he was a part of it.
Right.
And I know from the documentary that I know it was not a light undertaking. I could be spreading misinformation here, but I know that she paid for it, right?
Yeah, I
she
believe
ended up
so.
funding it privately, and I don't know if there was any debt associated with it or not. But it'd be interesting to speak to that and how they're going to divide said asset or debt, because they both have intellectual property that they've worked on during the marriage, which, as we know, is also community.
Well, I think even more interesting than the documentary, which it wouldn't surprise me if there was debt associated with it, but is her canceled tour.
Oh, yes.
Which was supposed to be going on during 2024. So I don't know how you get paid on tours, but
I don't know either.
If she got paid up front and then had to pay it back, that could add some complications as well.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds and plays out. Obviously, everybody's heavily invested, and I feel for these celebrities who have this situation where it is playing out so publicly, especially in the same token. Of course, they did publicly make a documentary about their love story, so I guess it comes par for the course, as they say. But
I know what you're saying. But I have a soft spot, I think, for Jennifer and Ben Affleck.
So I wanted them to work.
Definitely.
I don't know if I thought they might, actually.
I thought they might too. So I think they are just, this kind of works, we'll see how this works into a larger point. They seem to be like soulmates that just cannot make it work. Love isn't enough here.
I also love Jennifer Garner and Ben Affleck, though.
I know.
I also
to love both of them the same amount, the amount I do in such different ways.
We've been following their journey, and I think a lot of us kind of were rooting for this romance story that was that we believed in, we were invested in, and was being sold because they had separated, and they went on to have their marriages and their children, and then they get back together, and you think, they're soulmates and they're gonna make it last. I'm sure they felt the same. So I'm obviously not, I feel for the devastation of the breakup, their separation, and then also I don't know, I guess the point is I was hoping they would make it work. And
but you already are seeing people, come out like, well, Ben is this or Jen is this. And
I think what to your point about you were saying, it's really maybe both of those things are true, or none of those things are true, but sometimes it just doesn't work. That's
we'll
life,
see,
and
though.
We see that all the time in our cases, and it's easy. We represent one side, and we always hear one side of the story, and then you hear the other, and a lot of times it's not always, but a lot of times it is a mix of just, marriage is complicated, relationships are complicated, and thank goodness the law isn't trying to account for who's right and who's wrong, because it can't. There's just it's too complex. Yeah.
We need to make it as simple as we can.
Yeah.
Because of the complexity of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. But I am sad to see them separating.
I could see them getting back. And maybe that's why I'm not going to let myself be
we'll
too
do a
sad.
part 3.
We'll do a part 3. We'll talk about the prenup they get for the third one.
Yeah. Well, also, to my point, I guess, about him and Jennifer Garner being so cute together. I recently
They can also get back together. That's fine,
pictures
too.
of them smiling, happy family. And I thought, that's nice, too. So, I don't know.
So we have 2 options for Ben, and only 2 options.
Hopefully they go on to have what we wish for our clients, the next chapter.
I hope this is quick. They move on, and exactly.
It doesn't get messy. Yeah.
Messy. You don't need to get bogged down.
But also, if it does get messy, we will be giving updates.
Well, either way, we'll let you know.